This is a production of World Video Bible School. To God be the glory.
Welcome back to this study of the Gospel of Luke. In our last lesson, we surveyed Luke chapter 15, which contains three parables. The parable of the lost sheep, the parable of the lost coin, and the parable of the lost son. The setting for that parable, remember, is found in Luke 15, verses 1 and 2. Now all the publicans and sinners were drawing near unto him to hear him, which was a good thing. Their purpose for drawing near was to listen and to think with the Lord. And both the Pharisees and scribes murmured, saying, This man receiveth sinners and eateth with them. And so with these three parables, especially the parable of the lost son, Jesus turns his story into an indictment against the scribes and Pharisees for their ungodly disposition. At the end of that parable, at the end of chapter 15, in chapter 16, verse 1, Luke writes, And he said also unto the disciples, telling us that the disciples were present, and now he's directing his attention to the disciples. And we read the story, a very peculiar story of a steward or a manager of his master's goods and possessions, who was being fired because an account was being called up from him on how he had handled his master's goods. And so this man goes out and finds some of the debtors, some of the people that owe his master things, and he's telling them to rewrite their contracts. If you owed the master 100 measures of oil, cross that off and put 50. Now, if I'd been the master, I think I would have been pretty upset with that, because that was not in the steward's hands or in his power to do. And if they owed 100 measures of wheat, he'd say, cross off that 100 measures and just write down that you owe the master 80 measures of wheat. And then the Lord peculiarly commends this unrighteous steward because he had done wisely. That's a very peculiar response. I don't think it's one that most of us would gravitate toward ourselves. And it's this type of parable or type of story or teaching of the Lord that really provokes us to do some serious thinking about what was meant or intended by it. And so I hope between this last class and this one today, you spent some time perhaps discussing with your students or with your fellow students what the possible meaning of this parable might be. In verse 8, to remind you of some of the material we covered in the last session, Jesus said that his disciples needed to be more like these lying scoundrels. Now, he's not saying they need to be lying scoundrels, but he's saying you need to be like them, for the sons of this world are for their own generation wiser than the sons of light. And then in verses 10 through 12, he presents a very important principle. He said, He that is faithful in very little is faithful also in much. And he that is unrighteous in a very little is unrighteous also in much. If therefore you have not been faithful in the unrighteous mammon, who will commit to your trust the true riches? And if you've not been faithful in that which is another's, who will give you that which is your own? Now, contrasted in this parable, and Jesus' telling of it, are the sons of the world and the sons of light. They're contrasted. Secondly, the faithful and the righteous are contrasted. And then thirdly, unrighteous mammon is contrasted with true riches. Let me ask you a question. Is Jesus approving of the actions of this cheating scoundrel? Does Jesus actually approve or ever encourage a person to be a cheating scoundrel? Well, obviously not. But I think that this lesson is one in Christian prudence. We don't hear the word prudence much. We don't use it much unless it's to say in a form of the word that such and such a person is a prude. But prudence, when it is when it is contrasted with wisdom, and sometimes it's not, prudence and wisdom are sometimes used interchangeably. But when there is a contrast, such as we might see in the life of Solomon, prudence is the appropriate use or application of wisdom. Solomon may have been a wise man, but he was not always prudent. God granted him wisdom, but the proper application and the proper use of wisdom, the ability to take a look at everything and to assess it quickly and to make a right decision and to act upon it wisely, is what it means to be prudent. It is, as some have classified it throughout the centuries, one of the four cardinal virtues, along with courage and justice and self-control. What is being commended in the parable is the resourcefulness of the steward in the story. Again, remember, Jesus is not urging us or his audience in the first century in Luke 16 to be scoundrels or clever. There's not even any real value, and cleverness has never been viewed as a virtue, but prudence is. It is the resourcefulness of the steward that is being commended. This parable is more an indictment on the sons of light than it is on the sons of the world. J.W. McGarvey, in his commentary of the Fourfold Gospels, wrote this: in verse 8, the Lord himself gives the key to the parable, which is that the son or the children of light in the conduct of their affairs should emulate the wisdom and prudence of the children of the world in the conduct of their affairs. He went on to write, the child of light is to be equally shrewd and wise in the management of his affairs, using, however, only those means and methods which are permissible in his sphere of action. To be sure, the steward in the story is judged by Jesus to be unrighteous. What the man did is not being commended by the Lord, but that he was exercising himself in preparation for life is what is being commended. It is his resourcefulness, not what he did, but the fact that he was resourceful. He's not saying that we should be resourceful by appealing to wicked means to maintain ourselves in this life. Jesus' indictment is this, as recognized by Trench, quoted by Lightfoot. Christians bestow less pain to win heaven than the children of the world bestow to win earth, that they are less provident in heavenly things than those are in earthly, that the world is better served by the servants or by its servants than God is by his. Lightfoot continued by writing, if Christians were as diligent and resourceful in kingdom business as businessmen are in worldly business, what a marvelously different world it would be. So just like the unrighteous steward made friends by deceitful means, so the Christian should make friends by means of the resources God has made available to him, unrighteous mammon or money. The term mammon is found 3 times in our text and only one other time in the New Testament, and that's Matthew chapter 6, verse 24, where Jesus said, you cannot serve God and mammon. Twice the term is personified as if it were a god to be served. The term itself simply refers to riches, avarice, and worldly gain. The reason Jesus refers to it as unrighteous mammon is probably because of the dangers normally associated with money. Remember 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 10, where Paul wrote, the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil, which some reaching after have been led astray from the faith and have pierced themselves through with many sorrows. Now, money itself is not what's being condemned here, but it is the love of money. And the Apostle Paul in 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 through 5, expresses for us another great warning about unrighteous mammon. If you would open your Bibles to that text, because there are several statements made there that I think are significant. Paul writes, beginning in verse 1 of 2 Timothy 3, "But know this, that in the last days grievous times shall come, for men shall be lovers of self." I have that circled in my Bible. "Lovers of money." I have that circled. "Boastful, haughty, railers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, without natural affection, implacable, slanderers, without self-control," which I might add is one aspect and the last of the aspects found in the fruit of the Spirit in Galatians 5. And isn't it interesting, unless God is in control of your life, unless God is in control, self-control is not present or will not be present. But he speaks of people being without self-control, fierce. Notice this, no lovers of good, traitors, headstrong, puffed up, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, holding to a form of godliness, but having denied the power thereof, from these also turn away. Now in these 5 verses, Paul speaks of lovers of self and lovers of money, people who are no lovers of good, and lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. Now, of course, unfortunately, much of the psychology, or what passes for psychology in our day and age, urges us to love ourselves. In fact, they tell us that one of our biggest problems is that we haven't yet learned to love ourselves. I don't think that's ever been a problem with man. I think most of what people do, even the abnormal behavior that characterizes some people, has been done because people thought it would make them happy. If we ever had a problem, it would be that we are lovers of ourselves rather than lovers of God. But this is a powerful indictment in 2 Timothy 3, 1 following, concerning being lovers of self and lovers of money and lovers of pleasure and lovers of no good thing rather than lovers of God. Jesus' point, I think, is this. His disciples should use the resources they have at their disposal for godly purposes, so laying up for themselves treasures in heaven. Use these resources while you have them before they fail you, so that you may be received into the eternal tabernacle. He says that in so many words in chapter 16, verse 9. And the warning Jesus gives is this: if you are unfruitful with the material things God has given you, what makes you think that you'd be qualified to become a possessor of those true riches? The most prominent theme of this parable is stewardship. And again, I refer you to 4 points made by Wendell Winkler. He suggests that there are 4 principles involved in stewardship. The first is divine ownership. A steward, as it relates to this parable, is one who manages and possesses the property of another. In this text, as is supported by the rest of the teachings of the Bible, all that we have belongs to God. Our time is His, at least it ought to be His. Our money is His. I know that sometimes we treat money as if it's our own. It's like the preacher said humorously that the fellow had a wad of money in his hand and he drew a small circle on the ground and he threw it all up. He said, whatever falls in the circle's God's and everything else is mine. Well, there's no such thing as this is God's and this is mine in the life of a Christian. It all belongs to Him and is to be used to serve His purpose. Eldred Eccles said, it is given by God, owned by God, and to be used for the purposes of God. I like the way he put that. Perhaps this will shed some light on Jesus' statement in James 4, verse 3. You ask and receive not, because you ask amiss, that you may spend it in your pleasures. In other words, you ask and receive not because you're not asking for the right thing, for the right purpose, at the right time, for the right reasons. You're asking so that it may solely be spent in your own pleasures. The second aspect or characteristic of stewardship is human endowment. Although it all belongs to God, which is our first point of divine ownership, while it belongs to God, what we have has been given to us. It is His, but He's given it to us to use as stewards. The third point that Wendell Winkler pointed out is that stewardship involves faithful administration. Now, in the story of Luke chapter 16, the manager or the steward of his master's possessions is called to give an account of what he's done with his master's goods. Paul established a very important principle along these lines in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 2. He wrote there, "It is required in stewards," or we could say in managers, "that a man be found faithful." This is the very point of conflict in the parable. The master of the story brought the steward of his own goods into question because he was accused of squandering or wasting his master's goods. Look, if you will, at 1 Timothy chapter 6 for an example of how a rich person is counseled by God to use their money. In 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 17 through 19, Paul writes, "Charge them that are rich in this present world, that they be not high-minded, nor have their hope set on the uncertainty of riches, but on God who giveth us richly all things to enjoy. That they do good, that they be rich in good works, that they be ready to distribute, willing to communicate, laying up in store for themselves a good foundation against the time to come, that they may lay hold on the life which is life indeed." I would venture to say that in America, and if you are an American watching this video, that by the standards of the world as a whole, we are all very rich and will be held accountable for how we have used our wealth. I should say how we have used God's wealth and God's riches. One commentator made this observation. They said Christians must be so free from the low, selfish, and covetous motives that dominate the unjust steward of the parable, that they will use the worldly goods entrusted to them by the Father in a manner that will bring blessings to others and be conducive to their own eternal welfare. And then fourthly, from the points developed by Wendell Winkler, is this idea of an inevitable accounting. The unfaithful steward was apparently taken by surprise when called into question. It may very well be that some of us will be taken by surprise when we are called to give an account. The way we account for our use of unrighteous mammon will determine what master we serve. In chapter 16 of Luke, verse 13, Jesus ends His instruction concerning the unrighteous steward by saying this, "No man can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon." Well, if you can't, don't try. You're going to have to decide. We're all going to have to decide who we will serve. It will either be God or mammon. And the Pharisees, described in the very next verse, are described ironically as lovers of money, which means they were haters of God. Financial matters are spiritual matters. Financial matters point to where our affections lie, and they point at whom we serve. And you cannot serve two masters, God and mammon. The bottom line is this: We should serve God with the resources at our disposal, with the fervency with which the world, or with the fervency the world uses to obtain its worldly pursuits. Can you imagine how strong the church would be if we pursued divine ends and goals in life with the same intensity that the world pursues its worldly pleasures? Well, let's turn our attention now to Luke chapter 16, verses 9 through 31, the story of the rich man and Lazarus. Our study in Luke has us in the same setting as the last couple of texts. We still have the publicans and sinners drawing near to hear Jesus. The scribes and Pharisees were still complaining, or have complained about Jesus taking up time with sinners and publicans and eating with them. He began his discourse on this occasion, the same occasion that of our text, of this upcoming text. He began the discourse with three parables: the parable of the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the lost son. He then addresses his disciples with the parable of the unrighteous steward, chapter 16, verses 1 through 13. The Pharisees heard this parable and scoffed. In chapter 16, they are characterized by Luke as being lovers of money, which means they are haters of God. And they are characterized by Jesus as those who justify themselves in the sight of men. If you would, notice verses 14 through 17. The Pharisees, who were lovers of money, heard all these things. In other words, they heard the parables in chapter 15. They heard the parable of the unrighteous steward in chapter 16. And they scoffed at him. And he said unto them, Ye are they that justify yourselves in the sight of men, but God knoweth your hearts. For that which is exalted among men is an abomination in the sight of God. Isn't it interesting how that works? Things that are truly of value to a Christian is judged as an abomination by the world. And things that are of genuine value to the world are usually judged by us as an abomination also. Verse 16, the law and the prophets were until John. From that time the gospel of the kingdom is being preached, and every man entereth violently into it. But it is easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for one tittle of the law to fall. And this leads us to our present study in Luke chapter 16, verses 19 through 31, the story of the rich man and Lazarus. Let's read that story together, and then we'll make some observations. We'll survey it and then make some observations. Well, I might add too that I don't know how it fits in, but in chapter 16, verse 18, we have this statement about marriage and divorce. Jesus said, Everyone that putteth away his wife and marrieth another committeth adultery, and he that marrieth one that is put away from a husband committeth adultery, which is a parallel teaching to Matthew 19, verses 1 through 9, and Matthew 5, around verses 31 and 32, and Mark chapter 10. And I know it's not out of place, but it just seems out of place in having read the parable and then the statement about the Pharisees. And there's this one statement by Jesus about divorce and remarriage. But it has its place, and its places between his judgment of the Pharisees and the story of the rich man and Lazarus. Beginning in verse 19, Jesus said, Now there was a certain rich man, and he was clothed in purple and fine linen, faring sumptuously every day. And a certain beggar named Lazarus was laid at his gate, full of sores, and desiring to be fed with the crumbs that fell from the rich man's table. Yea, even the dogs came and licked his sores. And it came to pass that the beggar died, and that he was carried away by the angels into Abraham's bosom. And the rich man also died, and he was buried. And in Hades he lifted up his eyes, being in torments, and seeth Abraham afar off, and Lazarus in Abraham's bosom. And he cried and said, Father, Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus, that he may dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue. For I am in anguish in this flame. But Abraham said, Son, remember that thou in thy lifetime remembered your good things, and Lazarus in like manner evil things. But now here he is comforted, and you are in anguish. And besides all this, between us and you there is a great gulf fixed, that they that would pass from hence to you may not be able, and that none may cross over from thence to us. And he said, I pray thee therefore, Father, that thou wouldst send him to my father's house. For I have 5 brethren, that he may testify unto them, lest they also come into this place of torment. But Abraham said, They have Moses and the prophets, let them hear them. And he said, Nay, no, Father Abraham. But if one go to them from the dead, they will repent. And he said unto him, If they hear not Moses and the prophets, neither will they be persuaded if one rise from the dead. Of course, that last statement puts a tremendous power into the writings of the law and the prophets. Most commentators either assume or argue that this text is another of Jesus' many parables. In a rather inconclusive survey that I conducted among several of the books I have, commentators and commentaries and books that deal explicitly with or specifically with the parables, the majority of the authors view this as a parable. 2 authors debated this issue in their own works and left the matter inconclusive. One author did not include the text in his book on the parables, and our brethren among the various lectureships centered around the parables have avoided it or have avoided including it in their study of the parables. Now, while it is within the realm of possibility, I have not viewed this text as a parable because of the inclusion of names in the text. If it is a parable, it is the only one that uses names. Now, I know that some have argued against that by saying that the name Lazarus also means something else, and because it has a meaning, therefore it could be viewed as something other than an actual proper name. I have also shied away from viewing it as a parable because of the tendency of some groups to allegorize the text. Now, it's possible for it to be a parable without allegorizing it, but that is a tendency. The Jehovah's Witnesses are notorious for allegorizing this text to eliminate the idea of eternal punishment. For them, the rich man represents the Pharisees, and Lazarus represents the poor people whom the Pharisees have kept in ignorance. And while it may be a parable, along with Walter Liefeld, it is no mere story chosen for its usefulness as an illustration, but a rather sober portrayal of yet unseen realities. Well, like every other story, this one has setting and character and conflict and dialogue. Let's take a look at the characters. There are 3 primary characters in the story. The first character we're introduced to is a certain rich man. And he is described by telling us that, by Jesus, descriptively, that he is a man clothed with purple, which means he is a man of wealth. In fact, some purple dyes were literally worth their weight in gold. And he fares sumptuously every day. The footnote says, living in mirth and splendor every day. Now, I don't want to prejudice you early in this lesson, but the rich man is not the only one who lived in mirth or merrymaking. Remember the rich fool in chapter 12 of Luke, verse 19, who said, Take thine ease, eat, drink, be merry. And remember the servant who had convinced himself that the master of the house was delaying his coming. So they beat the servants and got drunk. Then we're introduced to a man named Lazarus, which in the Greek is the Greek equivalent of the Hebrew name Eliezer, which means whom God helps. He is identified as a beggar who was thrown at the gate of a rich man, and he is full of sores. It reminds me of Job. Job was, remember, smitten with boils from the crown of his head to the base of his feet. His desire was to be fed crumbs that fell from the rich man's table. What a sad picture this paints of this man. And only the dogs are moved with compassion for his condition. R.C. Trench, in his notes on the parables of our Lord, made this observation. He wrote, "This circumstance seems mentioned to set forth the cruelty of the rich man in its strongest light, that while he remained unmoved, even the pity of the beasts was stirred." I said earlier to you, too, that in an earlier lesson, that is, that a story is not a story unless there's conflict. And there is conflict in this story. In chapter 16, verse 22, Jesus says, "And it came to pass that the beggar died, and that he was carried away by the angels into Abraham's bosom. And the rich man also died and was buried." The death of both men provides us with a significant and profound turn of events. The death of both men unveils the real character of each one, and it unveils the conditions of their souls. The writer of Hebrews in chapter 9, verse 27 says, "It is appointed unto men once to die, and after this cometh the judgment." And that is exactly what Jesus is teaching here. When the beggar died, he was carried away by the angels into Abraham's bosom. What we see, I guess what I'm trying to say is that this is a very blessed picture of this poor beggar. But all we're told about the rich man is that he was buried. His burial, we could surmise, was probably in keeping with his economic status. R.C. Trench, again from his book on the parables, said, "This splendid carrying to the grave is for him what the carrying into Abraham's bosom was for Lazarus." Jesus said, in Hades, and the word Hades simply means the unseen realm, he lifted up his eyes. That is, the rich man who fared sumptuously every day, remembered, in clothed in purple, and would not so much as show mercy to the poor beggar and sick man Lazarus. In Hades, in this unseen realm, the rich man lifted up his eyes, being in torment, and he sees Abraham afar off and Lazarus in his bosom. Torment for the rich man consisted of the following. First of all, in verse 23, he sees Lazarus. Imagine being the wicked in torment and looking up and seeing the man, or at least being aware of the presence of a man who needed your help when while at life on this earth, or while living on this earth, but you refused help too. And in verse 25, he sees Lazarus in comfort, verse 25, which is contrasted with his torment. What would go through your mind if you had been in the rich man's shoes at this point in time? Whatever we might think, it's too late. He is in want of water, and no one who makes the Lord their shepherd would be in want. But this man is in want. He is in anguish in the flames, according to verse 24. Some argue that this depicts a future scene in which death and Hades are cast into the lake that burns with fire and brimstone, from Revelation 20, verse 14. For him there are the agonizing memories of his family. So there is memory in hell, or in torment, I should say. And of the way he refused to care for Lazarus certainly must have come to his memory. For him there was the realization that this state of being for him is eternal and unceasing. R.C. Trench again says, "We can believe that for a while all may have seemed as a fearful dream, but when at length he had convinced himself it was no dream, but an awakening." His horrible condition was also unchanging, in that there is a great gulf fixed between the two, and no one could pass from one side to the other, according to verse 26. And then from verses 27 through 31, still dealing with the conditions of the man in torment and identifying in this the causes and the reasons for his torment. He was unable also to help his brothers. He remembered that he has brothers and that they were in the same condition he was while he lived on earth. And he was hoping that some help could be sent and some word could be sent to avert them from this same torment. Now Lazarus, on the other hand, was found in Abraham's bosom and comforted, according to verse 25. When the rich man appealed to Abraham for mercy, Abraham said, "Son, remember that you in your lifetime received your good things, and Lazarus in like manner evil things. But now here, there's the contrast or the transition. But now here, he is comforted, and thou art in anguish." We have depicted here by Jesus a great reversal of fortune. The rich man went from riches to rags. Lazarus went from rags to riches. The rich man became the beggar, and the beggar became rich, but with true riches. The rich man fared sumptuously, but now was begging for a drop of water. The beggar, hoping for crumbs, is now full. In this life, the poor man begged for mercy. In the life hereafter, the rich man was begging for mercy. The rich man, while trying to save his life, lost it. And Lazarus, whose life was lost in faith, gained it. Augustine characterizes the rich man, and Augustine was a 5th century theologian. He characterizes the rich man by saying, "The proud man of time, the beggar of hell. And he lacked the drop who denied the crumb." The rich man's God was his money. He laid up for himself treasures and was not rich toward God. Remember, like the man who tore down his barns to build bigger barns in Luke 12, verse 21. He did not make for himself friends with the mammon of unrighteousness. Consequently, there was not one to greet him into the eternal tabernacles. What must be implied in the story concerning Lazarus is that he was a man of faith. The angels of heaven don't escort people to paradise on the basis of their being poor, just as the rich are not buried and experience torment because they're rich. From one commentary, we read this observation. Everything depends on the attitude which a person reveals towards his wealth and towards his poverty. Whether he believes in God with a repentant heart and serves Him, whatever his external circumstances may be, or whether he rejects Him, a thing which may be done in poverty as well as in wealth, which is a great point. When Lazarus died, he was escorted by the angels of God to the bosom of Abraham. When the rich man died, there were only his friends to escort his body to the grave. A final insult is dished out by the rich man. At first glance, he looks like some seed of decency and consideration for others is expressed, but what is implied is an insult to God. When he realized there was no hope for him in his condition, he said, "I pray thee therefore, Father, that thou wouldst send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brethren, that he may testify unto them, lest haply they also come into this place of torment." In his request, he is implying that if he had sufficient warning and evidence for his need to repent, or evidence of his need to repent, he would not be where he is now. It is God's fault that he was where he was. Well, our time is up, and I'll reserve my last few remarks on this parable or on this story for the beginning of our next lesson, and then we'll continue on from there. Keep reading. Read into chapters 17 and 18, if you will, of the Gospel of Luke, and try to keep ahead of me as best you can. Don't forget to find where stories begin and end, and keep asking yourself, how does this build? How does Luke use each story to build his case for his purpose, expressed in Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. And until then, may God bless.